The Xeno series of games nowadays really needs no introduction, from its humble beginnings with Xenogears back in 1998 all the way into the modern day with the Blade titles. These games truly contain some of the most finest experiences that JRPGs have to offer. Today, we'll be ranking each and every one of them. Now, I understand that this community has had some heated topics on certain titles in the past, but I make this video with only the most utmost respect to every game in this series, since at the end of the day, at the very least, they are all great experiences, no title is objectively bad. Before we get into things, for the record, I play through every Xeno entry out there, however this video will contain no spoilers for anything pre-Xenoblade, since those games have the smallest communities, and I understand that some people are holding out for a hopeful remaster sometime down the line. This video is just one person's opinion at the end of the day, so feel free to let me know your rankings for these games in the comments, and with all that out of the way, let's get things started with Xenogears, the one that started it all, spearheaded by the visionary behind this series, Tetsuya Takahashi. This game really is something incredible. It touches on a lot of sensitive subject matter, but feels the most uncensored when it comes to speaking its mind. I don't think a game like this could be made nowadays. The main villain of this entry is still my favourite in this series, just the concept of it is horrifying and some moments pull no punches in showing its impact. It made me think a lot about real life whilst playing and how the worst kinds of people are connected by a similar mindset. Among this title were the amount of games at the time that went for 3D characters on 2D planes. Xenogears however went for the opposite, having sprites in a 3D environment, and is aged incredibly well visually today because of it, alongside its anime cutscenes. The protagonist, Faye, is my second favourite in this series, with the game opening on a bit of a bombshell, immediately gripping the audience. It's crazy, but if you ever played this game, you'll notice how much of Xenoblade 1, 2 and 3 borrows from this title narratively in terms of its themes and some of its plot twist elements. Some games later on flesh out these ideas better, but narratively, this game is a powerhouse and was ahead of its time in some respects to this very day when it comes to its story. There are some aspects of this title however that hasn't aged particularly well, such as the load times for the incredibly high enemy encounter rate. It's also the only entry in this series to have random encounters, which on top of the loading can really break pacing and make exploration feel tedious. Also, the AP system is kinda punishing if you spam death blows without realizing that you're not supposed to in order to learn stronger moves. You can really damage your run, making your damage output pitiful in the late game without grinding for a very long time. Some dungeons are also just too big, and if you don't save stack, you can hard-lock your progress due to party members leaving with no prior warning, taking the equipment you left on them along with them. Xenogears will really make you miss the quality of life improvements in modern JRPGs such as the XP share. This game is also very challenging. I definitely recommend using a guide with this one. Regardless however, Xenogears is still a powerhouse today as it was back in 1998. Despite issues with Disc 2's pacing that every video points out, this game is one remaster away from being able to stand with the JRPG giants of nowadays. Overall, I'm gonna give Xenogears a solid B tier. Moving on, we have Saga Episode 1. This is a step up in almost every way. I love the cutscenes here, and the fact that they are fully voice acted really gives this game a premium experience. The sci-fi themes are more at the forefront here, even more than with Xenogears, with the whole game being set mostly in space. Shion is also my favourite protagonist in this series. Her arc to the third episode is an amazing journey, but I'm getting ahead of myself here. Most people know this series for Cosmos, who will become the somewhat mascot for the Xeno games, appearing in spin-off titles shortly after this release. The combat system in Saga is also a huge step up here. We still have the combo system from Gears, but now at any moment you can pilot a mech alongside having these animations that are like death blows that deal loads of damage. The only issue I found is that it can take some getting used to. It's not very casual friendly, especially with the names of certain attacks and moves, but it's definitely something that you can adjust to. Narratively, I just want to mention one aspect of this title that really pushes it above most of Monolith's outings, and that's really saying something. Once again, this section is spoiler free, but there's a character here that only appears in this game, is not a party member and has like 20 minutes of screen time, but is somehow one of the best written characters and stories I've ever seen in a piece of media. Hands down, this is one of the most well written journeys from any of these games in my opinion, and that is with the character of Commander Cherenkov. It's definitely the kind of writing that I personally want to see more from sci-fi psychological stories, and is incredibly thought provoking. It will definitely have you thinking. He's this very out there flawed character that you see the downfall of as a sub-story, and there's something very incredible about the writing and presentation to it all. Even just seeing this story itself, I would say is well worth seeking any means to play this game that you can. Emulation. It's the kind of stuff that really sticks with you well after the game is over. I highly recommend checking out episode 6 of the State of the Art YouTube series for a proper in-depth look at this small piece of Xenosaga episode 1's writing that is an amazing analysis overall. Now, I understand that Xenoblade is the most well known for good reasons, but I would love to see a community on the same scale as Blades react to the stories and characters of Xenosaga, since in some respects they can be a huge step up writing wise. Xenosaga really is a standout title that was far ahead of its time back when it originally released, and will be the first A tier that we'll be seeing today. Alright, right, our first controversial entry with Xenosaga Episode 2. The main director, Tetsuya Takahashi, took a step back from this project, with the scope of the Saga series being downsized from 8 games to 6 and then finally 3 titles. On top of that fact, Sony was also on board with localizing this entry, and as a result of this, Xenosaga Episode 2 has a much more realistic art style that hasn't aged as well as Episode 1 and can be a bit of whiplash when going from the first game into the second. They also had a lot of the cast change voice talents, which really affected some of the characters, with the main protagonist in particular, Shion, being a good example of this. Anyway, onto my actual thoughts. In some ways, Episode 2 is a huge step up from 1, with the mini games and dungeons in particular being much more well designed this time around. On the positive side of things, some of the animations are top notch and will make you wonder how the PlayStation 2 is even running this game. The cinematography in general has always been a huge part of this series. Also, this will be my first hot take with this series, but I actually think that the battle system in this game is way better than Episode 1. I've never really understood the community's hate for Episode 2's combat. You basically have to trial and error the correct set of inputs to juggle an enemy or boss. It sounds frustrating at first until you just strategize around building enough boosts and attacking with the intent to find the correct combinations and inputs to juggle your enemies. I mean, you can just look this up if you really want to, or save scum, but I preferred figuring it out for myself since it's designed around that. Also, Monolith Soft kept this idea with the Blade games, having this be the earliest example of break, toppling and launching an enemy. It all started here, and that's worth at least some respect. One last sort of out there take that I have for this game, and that is that the music was also a huge step up in this entry. Standouts in particular, a fatal fight, the main menu and opening theme, and I'm about to drop a bombshell here, but in my opinion the best lyrical track out of all the Xeno games is also in this title, with Sweet Song by Yuki Kakiura. If you don't know, it's tradition that every Xeno game has a lyrical song that usually plays during the credits, and it's always absolutely incredible, with Drifting Souls from Xenoblade 2 being probably the most well known example of this. So with all respect to the other songs, this is my personal favourite and always gets me every time. It's definitely worth listening to if you haven't, it's just incredible. Now with all that being said, I'm not a complete contrarian when it comes to this game. I'll definitely admit the story is the worst in the series due to all the changes behind the scenes with the scripts and scenarios. There are some moments like with Junior's arc that are pretty good, but overall it's somewhat disappointing, which is a huge blow for the game's overall ranking, since for a JRPG the story has to be good, even more so for a Xeno game. With all that out of the way, from me it's definitely going to be a high C tier. I have a lot of respect for this title, but without going too in depth and into spoiler territory, the story has a lot of issues. But it definitely has some great moments here and there. Anyway, let's move on to the next game. With the return of Tetsuya Takahashi acting as a coordinator, Xenosaga really needed to end with a bang after the rollercoaster ride that was Episode 2's quality. And what we ended up with was a game that truly delivered. This entry had me in tears by its credits. The story is on a level unlike anything before it. These interconnected journeys come together for a very satisfying payoff, and Shion is just so cool after seeing her arc reach its conclusion here. She has a huge change in character from the first 2 games, and what we end up with in my opinion is the greatest protagonist Monolith Soft has ever written. Without going into spoilers, a big reason why is the time that we spent with Shion between titles. This all culminates with her finally being able to stand up for herself by Episode 3, and her design has changed drastically to reflect this fact. She's much more outspoken in this entry, talking back to her higher ups after leaving Vector Industries. I personally find that a lot of JRPG protagonists can be a little unrealistic trying to please everyone, but Shion comes off as very human with how she interacts with the other characters. And after seeing her get walked over and pushed around in previous games, it's nice seeing her stand up for herself, and it's pretty relatable. Other characters like Junior and the fan favourite Cosmos really shine in this entry, with her rival Telos being introduced here. Speaking of, the cutscenes in this game are just out of this world. It also surprised me just how better this game looks compared to vanilla Xenoblade on the Wii.
Sandwich!
I understand that the Wii is practically a PlayStation 2 when it comes to specs, but this is still very impressive. Once again, the choreography and fight scenes look amazing and rival the kinds of moments that you'd see in a movie or an anime. Combat here really trims the fat from previous games and is the best so far, alongside its stellar presentation and easy to understand user interface. Also, the skill tree in this game is my favourite out of any JRPG. It's simple and well implemented whilst not being overwhelming and feeling forced, which is worth bringing up due to that fact alone. It's actually a really fun mechanic here. Episode 3 in my opinion is truly without flaws, which is why it's going to be the first S tier in this video.
I'm really feeling it!
After bouncing between Squaresoft and Bandai Namco, Nintendo of all companies brought the rights to Monolith Soft back in 2007, and this is still to this day the greatest example of purchasing talent. And what we ended up with from all this was a JRPG series that really needs no introduction, that being Xenoblade. This game was my first introduction to this series back on the Wii, and as a result of this still holds a special place in my heart for being the first JRPG that I've ever beaten outside of Paper Mario. Now, I try not to let nostalgia sway my opinion here. Xenoblade grips you straight away with its incredibly well paced beginning and also having its worlds be comprised of two titans, which is visually striking and really helped the game stand out compared to other titles back in the day. Cast wise, I will admit that over the years there has been some complaints for party members like Charlotte and some of the other characters. I understand that the balance between screen time does take a huge step back after their initial arcs are established, but everyone here is pretty stellar. Not all moments in the narrative land as strong as the rest, but in particular the chemistry between Ryan and Shulk is my favourite in this series, especially with the beginning where Ryan helps Shulk build his confidence with his visions of the future. Just the whole concept of relying on supernatural abilities with no understanding of them is a trope I really enjoy seeing in media. It really allows for some great storytellings in the beginning of a narrative. I also have to mention that Adam Haldum as the voice actor for Shulk is my favourite voice protagonist of all time. There's always been a certain grit to the way he performs the character that just can't be replicated. I'm glad they reused the original dub for the definitive edition. It's up there with some of the greatest dubs of all time for me personally. Melia is also introduced in this entry and is my favourite character from the Blade titles, who we see more from later on in the series. This game is also really good at having multiple fantasy races to help make the world feel much more diverse and interesting. Xenoblade was a huge breath of fresh air on the Wii, being one of the only JRPGs released on that system, which really allowed it to stand out more as a single player experience on a system mostly comprised of multiplayer offerings. Some of it might be more refined later on, like with the battle system in particular being rough around the edges when viewing the game today, but I'm giving this one a solid A tier. It might be a little too high to some, but I feel like without this entry, Nintendo wouldn't be where they are today as a result of it, especially when you consider how fans pushed hard to get this game released in the West originally. It's the definition of humble beginnings. Anyway, moving on to the next entry. Now, I remember being here day one for this one. We have Xenoblade X. A big issue I had with this game was how most of the fanbase hadn't experienced it. I would see time and time again people snubbing it out of discussions regarding the series, and it's always been overshadowed when it comes to conversations about gaming as a whole. I'm happy now that with the remaster it can finally get the credit that it deserves and will hopefully appear more in discussions regarding this series, since it's just as much a Xeno game as any other. This game has always been done dirty with how it literally gave us Breath of the Wild, with Nintendo being so impressed that they got help by Monolith Soft to help make their very first attempt at an open world game. But you know, even outside of its legacy, by itself, this title in my opinion is the best in the series gameplay wise, and I stand firm on this fact. Even to this very day, I always point out to my friends on the topic of open world games that this one lets you pilot a literal mech, no realistic horse that feels stiff that every other open world game seems to be obsessed with. Here we have full on transforming mechs alongside its own combat system, and it's incredible. I've always liked the original art style, but sadly it got a bit of backlash when the original game came out, with the remaster kinda changing our character's look, which depending on who you ask is a good or bad thing. I'll definitely adjust to it over time, but I kinda miss how all the Xenoblade games went for different art styles, but after the definitive edition for the first game, it feels like with the release of 3, they seem to be going for this similar art style each time, and this is definitely apparent with the upcoming definitive edition for Xenoblade X. Moving back to my thoughts on X, I also have so many nice memories with the online for this game. There was this feature with the Wii U gamepad where you could message random people, and I would have so much fun engaging in random conversations. I enjoyed making my own character and it really sets it apart from standard JRPGs, but once again it was kinda hated on for it at the time due to the protagonist being mute, but it never bothered me personally. Also, one last compliment, Monolith Soft knew that fall damage in open world games were annoying, so they made everything anti-gravity where you take no damage from falling. Absolutely the definition of true innovation, and proved that you should never make realism be the be all end all since we are literally on a fictional alien planet. Anyway, this is the best open world game of all time, do not underestimate this entry and by all means give it a shot when it comes to the Switch with a remaster, hopefully it won't get overshadowed by the Switch too. The only issue I can remember from my initial experience back in 2015 is that I kinda hate some of the alien races, especially with their voices. If you know, you know. Also, for a JRPG the story is more to the side, which makes sense for this kind of game since the open world is front and center, but it's still a dip to its overall reputation and ranking here given its genre. Anyway, I'm definitely placing this at the top of A tier. I'm looking forward to replaying this again and maybe that will affect my opinion in the future, but this title has always been ahead of its time.
Don't forget me!
Alright, can I be level with the audience for a moment? So for these next two games, I'm going to be completely honest and disclose that there will be some strong opinions. There's always this fear I have when making a tier list video and upsetting someone, but that's never the intent I have when making any type of content. I've really gone back and forth on this one, especially with being a part of this fanbase for so long. I'm familiar with just how heated things can get. But understand that as a fan of this series, I always have the utmost respect when going into every installment, and I like to be as fair as I can when judging any video game I play. This is just one video on the internet at the end of the day, and I understand that in Xenoblade 2's case it is a definition of a dead horse when it comes to people stating the same points, but hopefully my opinions will be different here. Also, I've constantly gone back and forth when writing this video between the tone of how to address Xenoblade 2 and 3, just know that regardless, these games are still amazing and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Anyway, tangent aside, let's get right into it. In 2017, the Xeno series will truly skyrocket in popularity with the release of Xenoblade 2. Coming into this game as a fan of the series from 1 took some getting used to at first. In all honesty, I would say that this is hands down the most mixed that I've ever felt on any piece of media. Initially, I dropped the game only to come back a year later and ended up loving it. Throughout the years, this game has been under the magnifying glass when it comes to its quality. On one hand, you have a world that's visually at the best the series has ever created with these titans, which can lead to some jaw-droppingly gorgeous vistas. The combat in this entry is also a huge step up once it all clicks into place with the blades that you can switch out of battle. On top of that, the post game is also the best that I've seen in any JRPG, to the point that it feels almost impossible to see everything that this title has to offer. Now, over time, a lot of the aspects of this game has grown on me that I originally wasn't a big fan of. The art style has aged really well, and I've really grown to appreciate the voice acting in this entry, with Rex himself having some pretty strong moments. Some of the party members are also the greatest we've ever seen so far, like with Zeke, Pandoria, Morag and Nia all being very likeable and having amazing character arcs. So why am I beating around the bush with my takes here? Well, first off it's because I simply hate being negative, but secondly it's also because I'm tired of the discourse with this title in general and I want to avoid it at all costs here. Does Xenoblade 2 have a slow opening? Yes. Does the game have strange writing choices? Also yes. But do all the highs of this game overshadow all of these issues? Absolutely yes. Over the years, I've found that on both sides of discourses, people tend to miss the forest for the trees when it comes to Xenoblade 2, with them fixating on points that I personally found that the game has redeemed itself on when it comes to its writing, especially when you reach the actual credits. I do think this topic overshadows the game though, to the point where personally enjoying it has been very difficult over the years without having all these thoughts in the back of your mind. Sometimes ignorance is bliss, and that is very much true when it comes to being a part of any fanbase. Going back to my personal thoughts when it comes to this game, overall I think it's amazing, however there is still one aspect that over the years of softening up to Xenoblade 2 that I find I can't change my initial feelings on no matter how many arguments I see defending it. It's not the gacha system, believe it or not, and a lot of the blade designs are pretty decent, especially with Nomoras. It's Rex alright, still after all these years I still can't like this character no matter how many videos or posts I see. I've come around to his design and voice over time. But my biggest issue with him is that I don't feel any investment in Rex as a character. A lot of the posts I see on him just boils him down to a Chad womanizer, and it's always made me feel off personally. Almost everything about Xenoblade 2 is amazing, especially in the later half, the titans, Jin, the spectacle, everything, but Rex for me just holds this game back on a writing level. Rex's optimism is his best trait and it further contrasts him from characters like Jin, but everything else about him I couldn't be invested in, especially after this series has given us such incredible protagonists in the past. With all that being said, once again, this is just one take in a sea of opinions, so let's keep it civil. Also, I'm more than willing to see other people's perspectives whilst protecting my own. Anyway, for this very mixed opinion, I'm going to be giving Xenoblade 2 its very own rank of being simultaneously the best and worst. I've stated a lot how much the stories in these games matter, and it's for Xenoblade 2 having the highest highs and lowest lows in the series that I'm presenting it with this placing. Now, if you thought that my original disclaimer was about Xenoblade 2 earlier, I'm definitely more referring to 3 with it. Xenoblade 3 is the most modern title in this series, and in my opinion, after my initial playthrough, my thoughts have changed greatly on it. For the record, this is the only game in this series that I've 100%ed and did everything including side quests. It's my most played Xeno game by far, so these points really come from my love for this series and with Xenoblade 3. Starting with the positives, the team dynamic here both narratively and gameplay wise is Xenoblade 3's strongest aspect. Party members are all likeable, and establishing them within the first chapter was a brilliant way to keep chemistry strong throughout its runtime. The combat and customization is beyond anything that I've seen in any JRPG, and it really pushes what you can get away with. Chain attacks are also fully realised here, feeling like a proper event and are well communicated to the player in terms of what moves actually do, unlike X's overdrive mechanic, which most people agree was very confusing to understand back then. Another positive aspect is most of its story, exploring the fish out of water setting where humanity is constantly stuck in a cycle only to break out of it for the first time and see the true beauty of the world is a very strong dynamic and kept me invested. Okay, now for the negatives. I've already said my preamble, so let's just jump right into it. Firstly, I don't like how this entry isn't a standalone title. Before this entry, you could play Xenoblade 1, 2 or X in any order you wanted as a standalone experience. Some of the references are nice, but I feel like this story really wears itself thin because now it has an obligation to explain everything from previous games. The strongest example that this issue introduces is with that picture. Alright, now I know that this is one of the most annoying things you can bring up about this series, but please hear me out. What gets me about this image is just how regardless of what's happening here, it just slaps you across the face. This feels like you took a screenshot from Xenoblade Chronicles 7 with no context to what's going on. Other narrative issues like this is with the end of the DLC and how it tries to tie into Saga on top of already introducing and forcing all of these plot points that I guarantee weren't intended to fit together in such a way. I'm a firm believer that if your story is a standalone experience or part of an episodic narrative, you should establish it straight away by the first entry. Think of it this way, when you first played Saga, you went into it expecting an interconnected story that would take place between multiple games. The name Saga, as well as the first game being called Episode 1, fully established this. Where Xenoblade gets it wrong is how it was originally like Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest, you could start with 1, 2 or X. Also, I know that 2 has connections to 1, but it's nothing the audience has to know before going into it, and most people started with Xenoblade 2. If you followed this series before Xenoblade 3, this was very apparent before this entry released. Nowhere in the marketing was this series ever advertised as an interconnected narrative. To me personally, Xenoblade 3 is at its very best when it's a story about humanity trying to avoid falling into the endless now as your party members are up against a force that is designed so that they can never win. When it starts leading into older games, it's no longer about Noah or Mia or anyone from 3 and ends up overshadowing them. In some respect, you could argue it's a form of fan service at times. Also, I'm just gonna say it, some of the art book lore for this game is completely insane. To further prove this point, the stuff about the Sword of Origins being Fiora, I'm just gonna say is stupid and in my opinion would be like making Sora's Keyblade Riku in Kingdom Hearts 4, it's so out there and I hate it so much. I lost my mind trying to understand what this even means, I'm really not a big fan of it. There should never be lore for anything in an art book or a model kit, it's kind of ridiculous. You can at least argue with Kingdom Hearts that the lore is in the actual games and not on the back of a Sora plush. Tetsuya Takahashi and his team are on the cutting edge with these games. I just hope that in their next release they give themselves more freedom with the storytelling. I love these characters, but seeing them more and more for me devalues their original arcs. And this is coming from the point of view of a huge fan of characters like Melia and Cosmos, but I'm content just seeing their original stories. This series isn't like Trails where they clearly established by the first game that this is going to be a huge interconnected narrative spanning different continents. Sorry for the story rant, I've just felt very strongly about this for a long time and I wanted to share my opinions on this new interconnected angle they seem to be going in. One final big complaint that I have with Xenoblade 3, and it's less of a hot take but it's with the actual world, it's very flat and dull here. I've heard that the reasoning behind this fact is how the worlds are merged together, but to me that's the opposite. Like the idea of Xenoblade 1 and 2's worlds being combined sounds like it would make for some incredible locations and vistas. I've also heard from other fans how it's flat this time around, so they couldn't make more interesting uses of geometry and big skyboxes. But to that point, I simply say look no further than Xenoblade X. For a flat alien planet, there are some incredible areas. It's still the best game in this series to explore, which came out over 5 years before Xenoblade 3. This has always been a staple of the Xeno games ever since Saga with its planets, or Blade with its titans, where these larger than life worlds truly feel alive. And Xenoblade 3 in my opinion misses this mark harder than any other aspect in the game. Okay, I've been really negative here and I don't want to sound like I hate Xenoblade 3, elements like the user experience and combat is some of the finest Monolith sort of ever put out, and once again the cast of 3 is incredible and they truly shine at times. It's just that personally, as a fan of this series since Xenoblade on the Wii, this entry has for me the most amount of glaring issues. This stems from the fact that I'm definitely the kind of person who prefers a standalone experience over writers having to answer every minute question and bring back plot points years after they've already been finished, risking ruining their original context. For all these mixed opinions, I'm going to be putting Xenoblade 3 in C tier. So my overall placements for these games starting from the bottom is Xenoblade 3, followed by Saga Episode 2, Xenogears, then Xenoblade 1, followed by Xenosaga Episode 1, then Xenoblade X and Xenosaga Episode 3 at S tier. Let's hope for a remaster one day. Also, Xenoblade 2 is both the best and worst, so depending on what day you ask me, I'll either say one of those answers. But by far, Episode 3 is my personal favourite game in the series as things stand at the moment. All that being said, this video is just one person's take on the series. As much as the internet will try to tell you otherwise, opinions are never stuck in motion and are always changing over time. Even by the time Xenoblade X Definitive Edition releases, I'm sure things will get moved around once again. But as things stand in this current motion of time, this is my stance on the Xeno series as a whole and what I would say personally are my opinions on each entry. I hope you enjoyed this video and once again let me know your opinions on this series in the comments, I'm curious. Also, any feedback on this video will be appreciated. Thank you so much for watching and I hope you have a nice rest of your day.
Die!